So we have a very interesting panel coming up on taxonomies in terms of interoperability. So we're going to talk about development, but also on the implementation side. So before we get onto it, please welcome the panelists. We have Matias Rebello Cardomingo. Matias is from the Ministry of Finance, and he's leading a lot of work on the Brazilian taxonomy. So we'll have a lot of questions for you on what to expect. Please. Uh, Ira- Thank you. And Iraís Vásquez. Iraís is from Finance in Motion. So Iraís comes from the investment side of you, but she's also had a lot of experience in leading some of these sectoral development in Mexico, implementation in Colombia. So thanks a lot, Iraís. And now on the implementation side, so because we have so many taxonomies, we have to see if it's really working. So we have two important panelists. So one is Cristóvão from ERM, who's going to tell us how companies are using this. And of course, Rebeca Lima from CDP. Rebecca has a lot of data on taxonomy usage and implementation. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting panel. So thanks everyone. Again, I'm speaking in English. Sorry for this. I understand a bit of Portuñol, but not not very well. So before I open the floor, just to talk about interoperability. So we have about just I was looking at the data yesterday that we have about 42 countries in different levels of taxonomy development globally, and in Latin America and Caribbean alone, we have about 12 countries in different stages of development. Now, with so many taxonomies that are coming up everywhere, there's a lot of need for interoperability to ensure that, we don't want 190 taxonomies with completely different logic. We want them to be interoperable. So there are a lot of good work happening in the region, whether it's G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group or the Latin American and Caribbean Common Framework. But then we'll hear, before we enter into taxonomies per se, I think it would be good if, Matias, if you can give us an insight into what's the stage that Brazil is in currently. How is the taxonomy being developed? What can we expect in future? What is the timeline, objectives? So just to set a context before we get onto the panel discussion.
Alô, alô. Bom dia.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Climate Bonds for organizing this amazing event. We see how people are interested and how full this room is. And I'd like to thank Vish for mediating this panel. If you don't know, interoperability is synonym to Vish. He is simply the person who pairs all of the taxonomies that are relevant. So he should be the panelist. But I'm just going to give you a quick overview saying that our national taxonomy will start on the technical work, selecting the eligible projects to define the key indicators. Climate bonds will handle all the sectors that were chosen. We chose 8 sectors with the CNAI, but this is just a first look. Then we need to delve into the more delimited activities. And with that, PNUMA and GAZ put together a very robust team for inequalities that's going to be developed by the GVSIS, the Sustainable Research Center, looking at the inequalities together with the Racial Equity Pact. And the monitoring side will be handled by Impact, a consulting firm. And as Sean also told us, in November at COP, we are going to present the first draft for a long public hearing process, and then we're going to announce the civil society participants for governance, who's going to really give opinions about the intermediary product. So it's going to be very exciting until November, but we want to go to COP, to COP, with something really robust for the public hearing.
terms of objectives of the taxonomy, I know that Brazil has also announced other objectives, addition to mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity, and other social objectives. So how do we see that coming, and when is that going to happen?
É,
I'm going to actually take a few extra minutes here because the main discussion for us is to understand what to do with the development of the taxonomy and where we want to go with it. So, just a quick timeline. Let me just provide some insight because there's a great discussion around the conception of the who are the stakeholders or the interesting parties. And at the end of the day, there's a very long discussion debate about the corporate governance structure. I was just reading these days when Germany was structuring its governance, its corporate governance, following what had been developed in the UK and the US, especially the UK and what France already had in place, actually created a new board made up of third parties, which is what we have until today with the German corporate governance for unions, incorporating unions within the stakeholders for the board. That was around 1870, and it was a very the very initial stages. And in 1904, Germany, during the Namibia colonization, promotes one of the biggest genocides on the African continent. More than 70,000 people killed just to establish the German domain in Namibia. I think the legal discussion here is the transformation, the ecological transformation plan. When Haddad announced this in the COP last year, he placed this as a new perspective for globalization. I think it's important for us to think about taxonomy as an instrument to build stakeholders with a broader perspective. It's as if the Namibians had a voice in German corporate governance, for example. And what we want to do with the Brazilian taxonomy is to incorporate social goals, which was something that was made a priority for Latin American countries as soon as taxonomy arrived here. When it came from the EU, there were two very relevant consensus. Agriculture, where we still could not reach an agreement of the most important criteria, and the social side, also without a consensus. When we come to Latin America, Colombia introduces agriculture and Mexico introduces social goals, bringing also the gender aspects into the discussion, because it's a very different demographic composition for financial sustainability, including so many women. And in Mexico, gender was paramount because it was not just a huge inequality in the marketplace, but also violence against women and feminicide. And this year, last Sunday, the first female president has been elected. That might indicate the first phase of this type of public policies. What we say here is that gender equality is also an objective, but most specifically racial equity, because Brazil has received most half of the African diaspora during slavery. So looking at history to think about corporate governance starting from there is paramount to us to try to really close some of these historical gaps. And lastly, the biodiversity challenge. We cannot separate climate issues in Brazil from the biodiversity discussion. We have 3/4 of our emissions, half of them associated to the land use, and 1/4 associated to land use, pasture use, or cattle or livestock. And what we want to do is incorporate biodiversity criteria in the first stage to actually look at the rural or the agro sector, agriculture, livestock, and also aquaculture and fisheries. These are the Brazilian challenges, the social issue and biodiversity due to its intrinsic relation with the climate issue in Brazil.
Thanks a lot. I think I'll connect your response to the next question to Iraís, who comes from the investment side of you. How do you see all these taxonomy development locally, and do you really use them? Because we see so many differences, whether it's regionally or globally speaking. And also, as Matias mentioned, especially in the region, we see a lot of other objectives being developed: biodiversity, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, social objectives, Mexico again. Sorry. So how do you see the invest from the investment point of view, looking at these different taxonomies locally? Do you see differences? Is it useful?
Perdão, o microfone dela não está chegando. Bom, eu dizia que, primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer a Climate Bonds Initiative em nome da Finance in Motion e, principalmente, a La Green Fund. Eu estou muito feliz de estar aqui e gostaria de agradecer o Vish por mediar esse painel, aos colegas, painelistas também. Eu gostaria de dizer que eu também falo um pouco de portunhol, então peço desculpas por continuar aqui em inglês. E eu preparei já as minhas respostas, então vou usar aqui as minhas anotações. Eu acho que é bem relevante mencionar que a comunidade de investidores percebe a interoperabilidade de taxonomia como algo bem positivo. Mas é algo é bem relevante e importante também mencionar que o desenvolvimento das taxonomias precisam muito bem socializadas a fim de se adaptar à realidade de cada país. E até agora, na minha experiência, eu vejo bastante envolvimento
Mexico and in Colombia. I think something that is crucial is that it's well socialized, because the reality in each country, both like economic, technology, and so on and so forth, is not the same. So it's relevant to have like an homogeneous methodology. The technical way of measuring thresholds is relevant, but to take in mind or to have in mind that, the capacities of each country are different, right? So in that sense, I will say that in terms of perception, there are three main aspects that are quite relevant for investors. First is the enhancing of clarity and transparency. By this, I mean the clear definitions. Like local taxonomies offer precise definition of sustainable activities, helping investors to identify and support genuine green investments. Also, reducing greenwashing and any kind of washing, like social washing and other kind of washing, by providing the clear criteria. These taxonomies help to reduce the risk of, as I was saying, any kind of washing, where companies, a real sector and financial sector might understand the same language when we are talking about climate or sustainable investment. The second main aspect, I would say, is the regulatory compliance. And by this, I mean the alignment with national goals, like NDCs. We as investors, we recognize that local green taxonomies align with national environmental and climate goals, and this ensure that our investments support the local policy objectives, right? Also, I would say the facilitation of reporting. This is quite important, and I'm part of the technical assistance team in Finance in Motion, and we really foster to follow the best international practices in terms of post-issuance report. This is something super relevant. And I would say that the third point in terms, or the third main aspect, is the market confidence, right? Investors, we need confidence. We need to trust that our resources where we invest are really aligned with our sustainability strategy. So a well-defined taxonomy increase investors' confidence by ensuring funds, like we are directing towards sustainable activities. And regarding the adaptation, because I think that's also very important. How do we as investors adapt to all these new taxonomies, new regulations, and so on and so forth? I would say that the integration into existing frameworks, like the harmonization with global standards is super relevant. And by global standards, I mean, for example, the EU taxonomy or also the climate bonds standard. This ensure the consistency and comparability across different markets. And second of all, I would say the regional adaptation, right? We are conscious that Latin America is not the same reality as the EU taxonomy, but or the reality in Europe, because the gaps regarding technology and ambitious and capacities on each country, as I was saying. So we are conscious about that. And as I was saying, it's quite relevant that the taxonomies are comparable. That doesn't mean that the threshold has to be the same in each different context, right? And yeah, as I was saying again, reporting and disclosure, in his reporting practices, investors, we should incorporate the criteria from local green taxonomies into our reporting practices. And yeah, I would say that would be my perception.
Thanks a lot. I think you touched upon a lot of interesting points that come up in all the pilots in the region, the capacity building and lack of sufficient guidance. I think we'll come back to that, but connecting your point to the next question to you, Cristóvão, in terms of users, let's say the entities or companies, what challenges do you see, especially when we're talking about multiple taxonomies, complying to European standards, complying with national standards, etc.? And also in Brazil specifically, how do you see the deals that are being structured? Are they very different compared to, let's say, I don't know, Europe or other standards that other countries are using? Maybe you can give us a bit of insight there.
Okay, thank you for your question, Vish. Vou responder em português.
I will answer in Portuguese and try to speak faster, try to speak slowly to help the translators. First of all, good morning, and I'd like to thank Climate Bonds Initiative for the invitation to be here. It's been almost 10 years since the first time we were able to work together to check and to certify climate bonds here in Brazil and Latin America. And since then, we've worked on over 200 green bonds, social bonds, sustainable bonds operations, and most of them as Finanças do Bem. You might know us as that name, and now we are part of the ERM group. Now, back to your question. I think an important point to mention is how important taxonomies are in the sustainable finance aspect. Typically, green bonds will be based on green bond principles and social bond principles and other references that are very based on principles and require this complementary aspect for technical and scientific references so that we are certain that we are calling things green and sustainable projects and activities that are truly considered green and sustainable. We had the avant-garde or the leadership of the European standards with the launch of the EU taxonomy and the Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy that was the north for a long time for the market in all regions, not just for Europe or this was also brought to Latin America, Asia, Africa, etc., and other countries that were accessing this sustainable debt market.
And naturally, the industries that took off when we look at the start of the sustainable debt markets in Brazil and Latin America were those markets that were more easily connected or aligned to these European taxonomies. The big question is that with time, this created some difficulties and some restrictions that are much related to the context of our market and our region, and that we, as framework structures, as a technical arm to support issuers and financial institutions in these operations, we had to learn how to deal and how to interpret, and in some cases, to learn to tropicalize. If I could bring a very specific example, when we talk about production of biomethane in landfills, we talk about the huge potential that Brazil has in the production of biomethane, known as green natural gas, and so on. If we think about European standards and taxonomies, typically investments in producing biomethane in landfills that are still receiving garbage, they are still open and operating landfills, they wouldn't be eligible. This makes all sense in the context of waste management in the European Union, because they are at another point in the management of solid waste, and you have other solutions that are better than the landfills. But we know that the reality in Brazil are still the dump sites in many states. So we'll have landfills operating for a long time with a solution better than average. And the production of biomethane bring what we call climate environmental additionality, which might be considered deserving of a sustainable or a green bond. So it's important to bring this aspect that although the market has been guided from its beginning using the European standards, today we see the emergence of new taxonomies and new market references that help us to look at this more suitably of what can be considered green, sustainable or not. And most important, the moment that we've always longed for, which is to finally have our Brazilian taxonomy. We've had efforts in drafting studies throughout the years that served as a theoretical base for some sustainable operations. But from the moment we have the Brazilian taxonomy, this makes us more sure and give us more clarity of what we can consider green or sustainable in the Brazilian context, and also in the context of Latin America, because Brazil is inserted in a demographic and socioeconomic context that is much more similar to our neighbors in Latin America than to other continents. So it's a bit of this role that we have of understanding what the best practices are, manage to tropicalize to the region you're working on, and maybe the concept of the sentence that having as a guide the South effectively through the development of criteria that are aligned to science but also suitable to our context.
That's very useful, because that's what we see a lot of contextualizing, and we hope the Brazilian taxonomy will be very interoperable and also contextualized, and that's the hope as well. And I think on the similar lines to you, Rebecca, because you have a lot of data, so you know if this is working or not. So please let us know. Do you think entities, whether it's Latin America or globally, are increasingly using these kind of instruments, and especially with multiple regulations in different countries with respect to disclosure standards? How do you see all this coming together? Do you see differences, or is it harmonizing the standards or harmonizing the reporting?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Português. So, bom dia.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Climate Bonds, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here talking about the perspective of of those that collect all the data and see what's going on to contextualize. CDP is the largest environmental data platform in the world. We have data from more than 24,000 organizations worldwide. And we see a challenge that is present for CDP, but also for many companies in the different jurisdictions, how we actually harmonize the information, harmonize the data, and harmonize the taxonomy. So this is what we've been working on in order to try to understand how we can work and promote the interoperability of taxonomies and standards. That's what we've been doing at CDP. Our challenge, as I mentioned, is to have a platform to collect data that are comparable among different jurisdictions. Although we recognize the value there is in capturing the different nuances of different markets and specificities of different contexts, such as agri in Colombia and social in Brazil, today we try to look for the indicators and what are the main global consensus. So as a reference, we have still used the EU taxonomy. We know it's not ideal because the EU taxonomy is much anchored in climate aspects with a view from the global north. But as they are a pioneer, they ended up influencing many other taxonomy systems. So our approach has been, at this moment, to prioritize whatever is a consensus as possible, and as much as we can, what is common between the different jurisdictions in order to manage to give more solid guidance for companies, especially those that operate in global markets, but without removing the merit from regional specificities. So at the regional level, what we've been trying to do is to bring this data and share information with data, also with governments, in order to support the development of taxonomy in the different jurisdictions. We've been working a lot with capacity building and engagement and exchange of experience. And besides that, we've also engaged in some fora that address especially environmental data and alignment of mandatory disclosure and environmental information globally. Our global CEO, she's a chair of one of the main forums that work with environmental data. The name is Future of Sustainability Data, and the acronym is FOSDA. And there's a series of actors there because we understand regional taxonomies, but for those that such as us try to look at the whole, we're working here in Brazil, but also in Europe, in Singapore, in London, Mexico, and Colombia, looking at the whole and translating this into one single standardized questionnaire that will provide quality information to investors in Brazil, in the US. It is a challenge. So I'm not going to lie, it is a challenge. We are still working in a context that brings a bit of confusion in the market, but our approach has been to be careful with what we demand from companies. Today, the questionnaire is aligned to the EU taxonomy for CDP. I know it's not ideal, but at the same time, working with the different jurisdictions to see how we can harmonize as much as we can.
Just a clarification on that point. Do you see local or national taxonomies being integrated into your data sets? Do you see users asking for this, or what's the tendency in the region?
We see the trend mostly from investors requesting us to start to reflect national and local taxonomies in our questionnaires and our data, because of course they're the main users of that information. When we, very transparently, when we look at companies, they are still much concerned with the reporting burden. So what is going to be their additional work of having to report the same initiative according to different taxonomies? And so companies, they ask us to be careful. Yes, they are operating in national markets, but on the one hand, we're pressured by them, say, oh, wait a minute, let's hold this a bit, let's go slowly with what has been a consensus. And investors in more advanced jurisdictions, such as Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, I'm talking most focus on Latin America, they are demanding the more regionalized taxonomy, because otherwise we won't be able to identify issues linked to the use of soil and nature here in Brazil and biodiversity, for example, which is already impacting sustainability of business and investments. So I think this is extremely important, because otherwise if we do not have a taxonomy that brings social and biodiversity into the table, we run the risk of packaging a green product using only climate criteria, which are a consensus, but will have big inconsistency or lack of comparability around what are the social aspects that are included in the different products. So it is very important to bring this, but when we talk about mandatory reporting or even CDP, which is a more serious framework, then we've been pressured a bit to have to be a bit more careful and to stick to what is standard. And little by little, I believe it is going to happen. Brazil is not the first jurisdiction to include social aspects. I think others are going to take on the same journey. So I believe that the trend is for social and nature aspects, we're going to start understanding what are the common denominators that we can have as a consensus in a more harmonized taxonomy.
Thank you very much for that. And Matias, coming back to you. So once we have the taxonomy, what can we expect? Will this be a voluntary document? Will there be regulations? And are you thinking about any specific regulations in terms of disclosure or for products or labeling? So what's the idea?
So our expectation, as I mentioned, is to have the end of this public consultation at the end of next year, around April, so that we can start the voluntary adoption process. And what we can place as a reference timeline is what CVM has been doing with the S1 and S2 criteria for SSP, where Brazil was the first one to announce as a mandatory adoption for 2027 for calendar year 26. But the idea is that we connect that with a journey of sustainability reporting, looking at a broader journey. We have our secretary here, Rogério Ceron. I think that the issuance of sustainable sovereign bonds, for example, defines the curve for interest, such as Rafael at S&P he just left secretary. He was showing a very positive outlook around sustainability. And the definition of these other tranches and the definition of the curve will allow the private sector to engage in this agenda. And for sustainability reporting, it is just something complementary. It is the accountability of that letter of intentions from the initial issuances. Our idea is to match these initiatives from S1 and S2. When we published the decree that made up the governance of the taxonomy, we also published a declaration around sustainable financial for ecological transformation between the Ministry of Finance, SUSEP, PREVIC, and CVM. And in this declaration, we seek to build a background of what has been implemented in the regulation from the central bank. We have the risk management, ESG, and climate reporting. We have the SUSEP resolution that incorporates a series of governance criteria and also for reporting around sustainability by the CVM, the Brazilian SEC, as I mentioned. Besides S1 and S2, we have Resolution 175, which also addresses governance. So the CVM uses the image of the building blocks, right? So it's to add one block on top of the other and placing the taxonomy within this journey. At first, we had adoption calendar for 2026 for the first reports. We need to check the feasibility for that. But I think Rebecca brought an interesting point that come to us often, which is the weight of around reporting, the reporting weight and this burden, right? And how much labor that uses and how much expertise as well. So it's one of the themes that we have to look at very carefully. The EU has an initiative of adding technology to the XBRL language. So there is a report that not only is automated, but also able of generating easier data that is easier to be understood. So I think what we can say is that unequal and combined development, we come in later, but we can take advantage of the technology frontier that has been established. So the idea is to leverage that so that it is seen as a menu or a glossary of opportunities and not of cost. We want to gear that towards what we know is economic potentials in Brazil to contribute for this ecological transformation.
I think that's a very good message for everyone in the room to start being prepared to start using these instruments if you're not already doing it. And coming on this point, Iraís, I know Finance in Motion has a lot of experience, for example, in Colombian implementation. Do you see that having a taxonomy actually brings about a change in the investment? I don't know, maybe flow of international capital or preferential investments. Have you seen that kind of proof in the region?
Sure. Well, from our perspective in Finance in Motion and considering like the trends in the sustainable finance in the region, I would say that the development of a local taxonomy in the country definitely attracts international investors. As you know, like the Colombian taxonomy is quite aligned with the EU taxonomy, and well, at Finance in Motion, we have funds from EU countries. So we need to comply, and we need to align with the regulations in the EU, right? So it's a quite positive aspect that the Colombian taxonomy is aligned in general, quite aligned with the EU taxonomy. And specifically from La Green Fund perspective, through its investment in Colombia, we have observed that relevant benefits that a local taxonomy could amplify, including, I would say, three main aspects. The first one is the successful implementation of green projects by demonstrating the viability and profitability of green investments in the country. Also, I would say the partnership with local entities. This means to build a strong partnership with local financial institutions and companies that understand the local market. We have an office in Colombia, so we understand the local reality and the implications that being aligned to a local taxonomy involves. And also, I think the ESG integration, not only the social part or the sustainability part or the environmental part, is like to include the three aspects of the ESG criteria into investment processes. This enhance the rational investment overall sustainability profile, you know. And how to do this, I would say like there are two main aspects. The first one I have already mentioned is the enhance of credibility and trust, clear standards to definitely reduce any kind of washing, and the alignment with global standards, right? We need consistency and comparability. And this will create the facilitation of due diligence, you know, like standardized criteria facilitates the process of due diligence, which is quite relevant for us as investors. And yeah, I would say those are like the main aspects that the positive aspect that we perceive regarding the Colombian taxonomy.
Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Iraís.
Next to you, Cristóvão, in terms of best practices, what do you think are the best practices, especially when we're talking about labeled instruments? Do you see something which stands out compared to others? And also, from a user perspective, what would you expect from regulation point of view? Do you think there should be more regulation? What needs to be clearer? I don't know, because the ministry is also listening, so maybe you can give your point of view.
Perfeito. Daria para ter
Perfect. We could speak about best practices for a whole panel, but I'd like to focus on one specifically because it hasn't been as practiced as it should, which is just post-emission reporting. When we talk about CBI certified climate bonds, you do need to check after 24 months, but the climate bonds are a portion of the sustainable bonds and climate bonds available in the market. Today, we have most of the issuers of sustainable debt that are not reporting in terms of the expected impacts and resource allocation as it had been agreed or following the best market practices, and with very insufficient, non-audited, non-verified reporting, which might really lead to a disconnect between the success of the green bonds market in terms of numbers and the real impact that this creates. I think that start reporting more clearly with audits, with checks, is a best practice that we really need to undertake more assertively in our market. And on the other hand, this report needs to be useful. So many times we also see a lack of interest on the buy side in terms of the expected impacts for those debt issuances that were labeled green. Typically, a sustainable bond or green bond or any debt instrument is sold or is characterized as sustainable before it goes to market. But it's important to have this positive impact that these commitments be maintained until the end of the life cycle of the issuance or at the end of the project or program they're funding, so that there's no contamination or there's no distortion of the purposes of these resources that were allocated with good intentions, but the intentions need to be kept until the end of the mandate.
Useful. Actually, one of the big challenges that a lot of countries are facing after taxonomies is also having a monitoring, reporting, and a verification system in place, because you don't know once they're implemented how clear they are they really making an impact? And I think on that point as well, to you, Rebecca, do you have any concrete examples maybe of users using such data platforms, especially when you have different reporting standards, different taxonomies, to have an interoperability?
Well, thank you for your question. What we've seen, as I mentioned, is a lot of diversification. So how organizations are dealing with the interoperability. It's actually something that I honestly don't know if we've achieved. I don't think we are quite there yet, but what we've been doing is try to work on supporting these jurisdictions, trying to work on disclosing information, as we heard here, reliable information tracking, mandatory reporting. So we've been working on this framework, a broader framework beyond the financial system, so that all the different elements can provide support to really reach the true interoperability between the different taxonomies. What we see today, what we have today, are attempts, are pilots along those lines. And unfortunately, what we've seen, or I'm not sure if this is a good practice example, but what we've seen more frequently is using the European Union as a reference. So when we look at the global context, I don't want to say that this is a good practice, but what we most commonly see is using the European Union as a reference, using the European taxonomy as a basis to design the regional taxonomies. I think, let's say that this is a good practice, we'll call it that, because the organizations that are already reporting or using the taxonomies makes it easier for those who are adopting, because if they're adopting, they're already used to this. And it makes it easier because it harmonizes and facilitates a quick adoption in other jurisdictions that are using the EU taxonomy. And it really facilitates harmonization because we're using the same basis for reference. And this is what we've seen that actually accelerates adoption of taxonomies regionally. I'm not sure that this is ideal. I'm still not certain, but this is what we've been using as a reference because it was the first, it was the pioneer, and it helps the user. So for the user, it's been positive.
Very much. I think I'll put that question back to all of you now in terms of how do we resolve this? I mean, as also your final comments, because I think we are almost over time. So Matias, coming to you, how do you think the Brazilian process will include interoperability while ensuring that there is enough contextualization to the region?
Bom, primeiro
Well, first, I'd like to thank everybody on the panel. I think all the comments were really interesting, and it provides certain security for us to keep going forward and to work on this. It really puts our mind at ease. Today is a very important day, right? It's been 52 years since the Stockholm conference where the first climate discussion took place. And I think it's really interesting to remember that, remembering that between 72 and 92, the Rio 92, there were 20 years without defining global governance for climate discussions. And today we're trying to fill that gap and trying to incorporate this technological difference with this really important impact of human activity, as Sean mentioned, human led by men, and a technological impact of in the consumption of natural resources. So since Rio 92, we've created governance to have a minimum interoperability. I think the EU has become a reference, but climate bonds was the pioneer back in 2012 when creating a taxonomy that also became a reference to develop the European taxonomy. And China was the pioneer to implement national taxonomies in 2015 when they established their first rule, which was actually, and Pulgas is here, Maria Neto, who organized a super interesting event with CASI, which is an alliance of capacity building for sustainability reporting. And Majun, who is now leading this Chinese foundation about sustainability, he said that when the central bank published the document, it already became a reference and it started being used the very next day by all financial institutions. And what we see now is the convergence of all these different initiatives. We already have the Forum, European Union and China to build interoperability between their taxonomies. Colombia is doing the same with the EU. So inevitably for the Western world, the European taxonomy is the reference. It does have challenges with interoperability with the Asian taxonomies, but more or less, Brazil can contribute as we had contributed in 1992 and help Latin America mainly with social discussions and biodiversity discussions. Because whether we want it or not, this is a big concentration of it, and together with Congo and Indonesia, we can build a common agenda, especially for biodiversity. And from that point on, taking and trying to connect our little wagon with the train that is going by. We are a bit behind, and we know why, but it's better to try to catch the train now than just see the train go and we're not on it. So we need to take advantage of this global scenario for building a common language.
also owing to time, maybe one quick recommendation from all of you in terms of interoperability, what needs to be considered. Maybe Iraís, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, we'll try to be short and sweet. Um, I think I would like to conclude my intervention by insisting in the relevance of the properly socialization of a taxonomy when it is the process of development. And this means to involve technical experts, industrial experts, the real sector, academics, and so on and so forth. And in this respect, it is very important that when developing a taxonomy to considering the methodology interoperability during the process. And this means that we take in account that the threshold, the way that we measure it should be comparable, but that doesn't mean that the threshold are the same in the different countries, right? So yeah, that would be my conclusion.
Cristóvão, in terms of interoperability, what would be your piece of recommendation?
Bom, primeiro, obrigado a todos pela...
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. That little red clock is making me a bit anxious, so I'll try to be brief. I would say that there are challenges that are global and shared, and they need to converge technically in terms of actions. The carbon that is emitted here or not will influence Japan, will impact the land. The land that you deforest here will impact anywhere else in the world, and we need to have a more unisonous view on all of these practices that will be included in a taxonomy, and others don't really need to. In terms of social aspects, there are particularities in terms of what is a vulnerable population, what are the social characteristics and for each of these different regions. So these particularities also need to be respected, as well as the economic and natural values of each country. It's important to see convergence of the challenges that are global, but it's also important to respect the particularities of each region. Otherwise, we'll never have true applicability and convergence for the taxonomies. On our side, I think we are very much aligned with everything that we've heard here on the panel in terms of harmonization, convergence, common language. And in order to really leverage the agenda globally, we really need harmonization. We know that not all indicators are going to reach that very harmonization level as in terms of social issues, nature issues, but the main indicators, when it is possible to have common language, it's important to reach a consensus. I think we are more advanced on climate, so let's use that and maybe try to identify what are the other topics that can provide a common language and maybe something that we cannot, and that's okay. So this balance between what is common and what is not is what we need to strive for and try to balance to facilitate the adoption, because we're doing something so complex, so beautiful, so adapted, but it's not comparable when we think about information traceability. When you think about monitoring, it's faulty. And trying to find the balance to be something that really serves all of the needs, but that is also feasible and implementable with quick adoption and scalable.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I think very good insights, and we have a lot of learning from this session. And thank you, Climate Bonds. I think I pass it on to Julia.